So I looked at my analytics to see what kind of stuff my audience is watching, since Metaphor refantazio didn't really seem to stick with you. No hard feelings, by the way. I noticed Persona story timeline was a topic of interest. This isn't a discussion that comes up too terribly often for me, as most of the games are pretty airtight when it comes to that. Most mainline games take place a few years apart from each other, little throwbacks are sprinkled here and there, and most spin-offs take place a little after or before the games they're spinning off. With the exception of a few select games, these games don't really overlap too much. Even in stuff like the Persona Q games, those take place outside the timeline and get wiped from everyone's memories by the time the game ends. But if you take a closer look at these games, there's actually a bit more branching paths than you'd initially expect. Spoilers for the entire Persona series are fair game, so if you don't want to be spoiled, go away. Early on in the Persona series, there are definitely more overt references to other Megami Tensei games than in later titles, which tend to be a bit more subtle with them. I'm sure you've already heard a million Megaten YouTubers say this, but Persona was actually inspired by Shin Megami Tensei If, which featured the Guardian mechanic. Upon death, your human characters will take on a demon as their guardian, along with their affinities. Only your partner character will inherit their guardian spells, while the protagonist would only get the stat changes, as protagonists could not cast magic back then. You also still summon demons from your comp, and it still plays like SMT 1 and 2. The game actually lets you choose between a male and female protagonist. The female protagonist Tamaki appears in both Persona 1 and 2, demonstrating her knowledge of demons casually, but she never pulls out a comp or summons any demons to fight. In Persona 2, she works for the Kuzunoha Detective Agency, which is a whole other reference that I'll get into shortly. You'll see students in SMT If's school uniform around Sumaru City. Okay, back to Kuzunoha. This is a Devil Summoner reference. No one from Devil Summoner physically appears, but it seems as though the soul of Kyoji Kuzunoha possessed the man in charge of the agency, Daisuke Todoroki, and gave the man his clout. You wouldn't suspect that at all, unless you already knew the plot of the original Devil Summoner. You'll also notice in Devil Summoner Soul Hackers that there are NPCs with the SMT If uniform in that game as well. In the Devil Summoner TV show, a student in a St. Hermelin uniform appears as an antagonist in one episode. The student's name is Kamiya, and he summons Vishnu, who is exclusive to the protagonist in Persona 1. Some people have mistaken this boy to be the Persona 1 protagonist, but this is likely not the case. First of all, his name is different. Secondly, the Persona 1 protagonist isn't evil. I thought that much was obvious. Thirdly, Vishnu may be exclusive to the protag in Persona 1, but that literally means nothing. Do you know how many people in the Persona series use Susanoo as a persona? Lastly, the most likely reason is those are probably just reused costumes from the original Japanese commercials for Persona 1. These references are pretty superfluous details at the end of the day, as they don't end up amounting to much in terms of the Persona games, but they do insinuate some form of connection with those other games. Okay, now onto the stuff pertaining to the actual Persona games. As early as the first game, Persona already goes off into split timeline territory. I'm sure most people by now know that Persona 1 has two different scenarios, the sebec route, which is the straightforward one, and the not-so-secret Snow Queen route. There are certain characters you will never see if you don't choose one path or the other. It is implied that the two scenarios are happening concurrently, as in the PS1 version you can witness the school in its frozen state after you've already committed to pursuing sebec. The ending of the Snow Queen route also seems to just segue back into sebec, with you chasing down Kandori with Mark again, in which case maybe Snow Queen is the true canon route. Events from both routes are referenced in Persona 2, so regardless of which route the protagonist went down, they both still happened apparently. I guess Yukino stopped the Snow Queen by herself. Speaking of Persona 2... oh. So the ending of Innocent Sin doesn't exactly go well. The entire world except for one city gets destroyed, the main cast literally creates a new timeline and they all migrate to it. Unless I'm to believe the world was able to rebuild itself in just a decade or two, I don't see any of the modern Persona games taking place in the Innocent Sin timeline. Not to mention, almost all the casts of the modern Persona games were born before Innocent Sin takes place in 1999, so unless every single one of them was in Sumaru City when the rest of the world was destroyed, yeah, no, they're all dead. Any and all games going forward undoubtedly take place after Eternal Punishment. But wait, I think we're forgetting something very important. What about the universe where Persona 1 takes place in an American city? Yeah, we're talking Revelations Persona, the localized version of Persona 1 that we got on PS1. The Snow Queen route isn't accessible in this version without hacking the game, but it's very broken and very untranslated. But you can still see the school in its frozen state on the normal route, so it still happened. You might be wondering why this is even worth bringing up in a timeline discussion. That's because this is the version that Persona 2 Eternal Punishment on the PS1 works off. In English, that is. The localized character designs are gone, but the localized names are still somewhat intact. Full English names aren't used, rather hybrid names between the localized and Japanese names are used instead. For example, Nate Trinity, who was localized from K Nanjo, is now Nate Nanjo. This feels so fake, it's honestly really funny. That's not even where it ends though. No, in Persona 3, one of the strongest bows in the game is called Mary's Resolve. I didn't even realize this was supposed to be a reference to Mary from Revelations Persona, who was localized from Maki Tsunemura. I thought they were referencing Mary, Mother of Jesus from the friggin' Bible. In Persona 3 Reload, the bow would be renamed to Maki's Resolve. Wait, so does that mean the original release timeline takes place in the Revelations universe, and the re-release timeline takes place in the unlocalized universe? Probably not, I'm just fucking around. This clearly wasn't meant to be a lore thing, it's just really interesting to look back at Atlus's slow transition out of their 4Kids phase. Okay, the first 3 games start off a bit iffy, but you can pretty easily rationalize your way around them. Now we're about to get into the stuff that's like, actually contradictory with the rest of the games. The Persona Trinity Soul anime takes place 10 years after Persona 3, but the show started and finished before Persona 4 came out. And as such, nothing from Persona 4 is referenced in Trinity Soul. I've only seen a little bit of this series, but from what I've heard, they apparently made up some weird rule where people eventually lose their persona when they grow up, and Akihiko is the case in point example. Well, first of all, Eternal Punishment. Secondly, the rest of the games don't bother with that shit at all. Literally, the very next Persona game would give us Adachi. And then spin-off games would give us middle-aged Persona users. Also, the series would theoretically take place well after Persona 5 as well. After a certain point, Atlus would just stop acknowledging Trinity Soul altogether. So would the fandom. Alright, so most people don't really fuss over those first few examples. The whole time you were listening to that, you were probably thinking, yeah, who gives a shit? Don't get me wrong, I mostly brought those things up as a formality. But for some unknown, inexplicable reason, this is the one people love to argue over, about whether it's as canon or as valid as the original games. Funny how much these people complain about not wanting non-canon stuff in their games, when almost all of these games have bad endings. And if the other games are anything to go off, I don't think those are canon either. Persona Q2 acknowledges the alternate universe that Persona 3 Portable's female route takes place in. And as we've established, spin-offs pretty much fit perfectly into the timeline no matter what. Most of the contention around the female protagonist's canonicity is mostly just an excuse to invalidate her, because some people just don't like her. It's the same thing as arguing about how her side of the story handles Persona 3's themes. It feels very contrived. This is coming from someone who prefers Fess, by the way. Just like how some people can't comprehend mortality applying to happy people as well, some people can't comprehend the idea of 2 completely valid timelines existing concurrently. And even if we entertain the idea of there only being one valid timeline, there's still way more outside of Portable to take into account. Forget Portable, what about the weird memory wipe shit from Persona 4 Golden? So apparently, the original Persona 4 is the result of not saving Marie in Persona 4 Golden, where she essentially erases herself from existence. This means that most Persona spin-offs are still compatible with the vanilla game. Marie was always there, everyone just forgot. The only exceptions to this being Persona 4 Arena Ultimax and Persona 4 Dancing, both of which include Marie but take place after the events of Persona 4, thus implying the golden ending. If we're going to assume the re-release endings take precedent over the original endings, why are these re-releases more valid than their original counterparts, but Portable is treated as lesser? I've also heard some people say that Persona 5 Strikers takes place after the original Persona 5 and not Royal, simply because nothing specifically from Royal was mentioned. Obviously, the reason for that is because both games were being developed at the same time. I seriously doubt that major story spoilers from either game were being taken into account for either game's development. I've heard some people theorize a vanilla timeline and a re-release timeline concurrently existing. And thinking about this specific point is where it finally hit me. None of this shit fucking matters. Like, no joke, the story of every game, including spin-offs, is written so that you don't have to give a shit. Persona 5 still works continuity-wise, regardless of whether you're jumping off the heels of Persona 4 or Persona 4 Golden. Persona 5 Tactica still works regardless if you've played Persona 5 Royal or not. Unless you're playing the DLC. Marie didn't exist when Persona 4 Arena came out? No problem. Just include her in Arena Ultimax, don't make a big deal out of it, and it just works. Most games after Persona 3 seem to work off the male protagonist's continuity. But what if Atlus were to make one specific game where an NPC vaguely alludes to the female protagonist instead? It's not very likely, but realistically, they could get away with it pretty easily. Maybe the reason these games are like this is because the developers don't want you to think that hard about it. And if you do try to think about it, the writers just have a way of neatly tying it all up in the most mundane way possible. Which version of the game does this take place after? Oh, what's that? It can go either way? Okay. Don't get me wrong, this isn't me trying to ruin your fun. Persona literally just makes timeline shenanigans as uninteresting as possible. Even when there are alternate paths and endings, Atlus will just go, yeah, they're both true and valid. And honestly, I think I'm fine with that. Megami Tensei was never really about the expansive universe across the games. Sure, it's a thing that exists, but I think for the most part, the devs just want to make some neat references for the longtime fans to gush over. It was never meant to be something to really overthink, but fans being fans, it was kind of inevitable. They just can't help themselves. Is it fun to give a passing thought? Sure, from time to time, but I don't think people should put so much weight on stuff like canon. I'm not too hot on the idea of one version of the game overwriting the rest, as that kinda devalues the other versions. Like, the 80 to 100 hours you spent on the original Persona 5 was all for a non-canonical ending. It doesn't even seem like the devs care all too much about the timeline shenanigans either. The way they treat it just seems to be all in good fun. And I think that's how we should treat it too. In conclusion, I just wanted to call out the femc haters again. Like, comment, and subscribe for more. Support me for just $1 on Patreon if you love my videos. Bye! Guys, I made a groundbreaking discovery. Persona 3 takes place before 4.